For more than 50 years, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations has been the leader in promoting mutual understanding between the United States and China, the most important relationship of the 21st century. The National Committee strengthens that relationship by helping people on both sides of the Pacific to understand one another better and to address issues of mutual concern through exchanges, dialogues, and other activities. These programs address key issues such as economic relations, rule of law, security, public health, and the environment, in the belief that constructive Sino-American relations benefit both countries as well as the global community.
Stand by.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all joining us live across the United States and in China. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 100 venues in 44 states and 3 venues in China to our 12th annual China Town Hall. Our program comes at a critical time in the relations between our two countries. While our presidents Trump and Xi initially seemed to forge a good relationship, that is now being challenged. In its national security and defense strategies, the Trump administration branded China, along with Russia, a strategic competitor and a revisionist power. It has excluded China from RIMPAC, imposed tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese exports, limited Chinese investment, restricted visas for several categories of Chinese, and debated ending Chinese student visas to the United States. Last Thursday, Vice President Pence claimed China is using a whole-of-government approach to advance its influence and benefit its interests in the United States. For its part, China continues to restrict investments in many areas, impose tariff and non-tariff barriers on U.S. imports, appropriate U.S. intellectual property, block U.S. internet and media companies from entering China's market, and violate international law in its activities in the South China Seas. In my 41 years working on Sino-American relations, I cannot recall a time when the future has been so uncertain. Yet as the two most important powers in the world, cooperation between China and the United States is essential for dealing with critical transnational issues, including non-proliferation, public health, climate change, trade and investment, terrorism, and global peace and stability. This is why we are fortunate to have Secretary Condoleezza Rice join us for this program. As Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009 and National Security Advisor from 2001 to 2005, both under President George W. Bush, Secretary Rice helped formulate U.S. policy towards China, met frequently with China's top leaders, and worked with Chinese counterparts on numerous global issues. Secretary Rice, it is an honor to have you with us here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would also like to thank our partners at all 100 venues, the largest number we have ever had. Let me thank our speakers as well, a veritable who's who of China experts in America. We also thank the Star Foundation, United Airlines, our media partner SupChina, and finally, our very dedicated staff at the National Committee. We are now accepting questions submitted via Twitter. Please tweet us your questions using the hashtag CTH18 or tagging NCUSCR. Let me begin with a few of my own questions for Secretary Rice. But before I do, I just want to note that this year marks the 30th anniversary of the first time you participated in a National Committee program. In the summer of 1988, you were an associate professor of political science at Stanford University and joined a Sino-Soviet-American study group to China and the Soviet Union. Now, of course, you're back at Stanford holding 3 prestigious positions and having had an incredibly distinguished and path-breaking career in between. We're delighted that 3 decades after we first got to know you, you've agreed again to share your knowledge and wisdom with us. Thank you again for being here. Let me start with the questions. First, from 2001 to 2009, obviously National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State, what are the lessons kind of from that period that would be applicable today?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you to the National Committee, which has been a stalwart in helping in the understanding between our countries. And I was indeed a young faculty member on one of the trips, in fact, my very first trip to China. And I want to start there because what I really understood when I came into office in 2001 is that China is a power that has risen very quickly. I was in China in 1988, and the streets of Beijing were a few horse carts, a few automobiles, and a lot of bicycles. That's not Beijing today. And so this is a country that has risen and grown rapidly, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and is a force on the world stage. And so I think during our time, we understood that we had differences. We had differences about human rights, about religious freedom. We were beginning to have some differences about military policy. But we also understood that there were some things that we needed to cooperate in. For instance, China is a major factor in the international economy. No one can really imagine international growth that is sustained without Chinese economic growth. We needed cooperation on North Korea so that we could begin to do something to roll back Pyongyang's nuclear programs. And so I learned how difficult it is sometimes to get the nuance in U.S.-China relations and to work on the cooperative elements while trying to deal with the fact that you will have differences and being honest about those differences.
9/11 and the war in Iraq occurred during your tenure as National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State. How was China's behavior during those crises in American foreign policy?
Well, the crisis in 9/11, of course, really did expose that there were only 2 sides to be on. That was with the terrorist or against the terrorist, to quote President George W. Bush. And I will have to say that we had actually very good cooperation with China in getting, for instance, through the Security Council, resolutions on terrorist financing so that we could track terrorist financing and, in fact, therefore track terrorists. We had very good cooperation when there was need for sharing of information. Nobody wanted to be subject to terrorist attack, and nobody wanted another country to be subject to terrorist attack. This really was the terrorist against the international order, and I think China played an important role. I think that at the time, China still talked a great deal about non-interference in the affairs of others, and so perhaps was not on board with some of the things that we did, although they were very helpful and supportive of our actions in Afghanistan, which were directly related to al-Qaeda. But I would say that the relationship with China was actually very good during that period of time, and we got very good cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, branding China as a strategic competitor rather than focusing on the cooperative elements that you've laid out, will make it more difficult to cooperate in the United Nations and on terrorism in the future?
Well, I don't think it has to. The fact is, we are, in some sense, strategic competitors. It doesn't mean that competition has to be conflictual. And we compete in the international economy. Increasingly, we are competing for leadership in certain areas of technology. I think we need to, in a sense, take the venom out of the word competitor. Mm-hmm. And let's say that competitors compete within certain rules. So what should those rules be? First and foremost, in the international economy, let's try to compete in a way in which we don't take unfair advantage of an international trading system that is supposed to be open and free. Let's try to compete in a way that recognizes the importance of intellectual property and therefore respects the sanctity of intellectual property rights. Let's try to compete in a way that does not bring our military forces into such close conflict that we can have an accident. The first actual crisis in the Bush administration was in April of 2001 on Hainan Island, when a Chinese pilot downed an American reconnaissance craft. Our crew was held hostage for 7 days. It was a very, very tense time. We eventually solved that problem. But you know, that was an accident. Nobody intended that to happen. It was a pilot barrel rolling in international airspace. So as we compete, let's do it in a way that we don't bring our military forces into close contact with one another and end up in a confrontation that we didn't intend. And so we can compete. We're going to compete. Let's cooperate where we can. Let's compete where we must. Let's have our differences where we must. But let's try to do it in a way that makes the world safer and more prosperous.
With that view, what did you think of Vice President Pence's speech last Thursday?
Well, I thought the Vice President laid out a very compelling and, in fact, comprehensive case about the difficulties that have been growing between the United States and China. And let's be clear, this didn't start with the Trump administration. Issues about intellectual property go back for several administrations. I can remember having long conversations with President Hu Jintao about the need to protect intellectual property. In the Obama administration, there were concerns about what was going on in the South China Sea. I actually think the way that China 2025 was posed, it was posed as a kind of challenge to the United States for technological superiority. So these things have been building for a while, and I thought the Vice President laid out that case. Now the question is, what do we do about it? And the United States has many, many strengths from which to take on these challenges in a way that acknowledges China's role in the world. I'll give you an example. I actually thought when China came up with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we should have said, that's a great idea. We need infrastructure. Let's start in Afghanistan. Instead, we somehow felt that it was a challenge to the institutions that we had created. So if we can find those places where we can help to channel some of China's desire for an enhanced role in international politics, which it is going to have as a rising power, that will be a way to make this competition not one that is dangerous. In the North Korean situation, nobody is going to benefit from a North Korean regime that is as closed and opaque as that regime, having a nuclear weapon capable of reaching the United States. Nobody benefits from that. And so that's an area where we need and should seek the cooperation of China, and China should want to cooperate. So I thought the Vice President laid out the case. It's a case that's been building for some time, and now the question is, what do we do about it?
Your kind of, when AIIB was proposed, obviously the United States decided, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was proposed, the United States decided not to join. Is it possible we'll see a reversal of that position and the United States will join?
Well, I don't know if that's even being considered. It's certainly something I would favor because from what I know of the bank, and I've met its leadership, it's actually trying to be transparent. It's trying to work by international standards. It sought a lot of advice from the World Bank and indeed from American private banks. And as I said, we need infrastructure around the world. And as long as it's transparently done, I think this could be a place for cooperation. Now, there are some elements at efforts at infrastructure through One Belt, One Road that look somewhat different than kind of transparent international effort. And we can get into that if you would like. But the AIIB, I would hope the United States might reconsider.
And it's living by global kind of standards.
Absolutely. Trying to do that, yes.
They clearly were doing that. During the Bush administration, you're very strong supporters of, maintaining the one China policy.
Yes.
And when Chen Shui-bian tried to kind of change that, President Bush said, no unilateral changes in this policy. Is the Trump administration drifting away from that?
Oh, I don't think the Trump administration is drifting on this issue. I think that, in fact, the one China policy is in place. It's likely to remain in place. Let's remember that the United States has certain obligations to Taiwan. And the Bush administration carried those out. I remember our arms package to Taiwan was not so favorably viewed by the Chinese in 2001, never is. But we have an obligation to help Taiwan defend itself. Taiwan is also a democracy. Taiwan is also a market economy. And I've always hoped that China would begin to see that we could open up international space for Taiwan, not in recognition of Taiwan as a separate country, but in recognizing that Taiwan is a special entity. So, for instance, the World Health Organization. This is the kind of thing where when you have an epidemic like SARS from a few years ago, you would want Taiwan to be a part of that because it's right in harm's way for something like the SARS epidemic. We have Taiwan sitting at the table at the Asia-Pacific Economic Council. It's never hurt anyone. So let's open up space for this democratic, market-based economy, which, by the way, has very tight economic relations with China. And I think that there's plenty of room to do that without violating in any sense the one China policy.
Last question for me, then I'm going to go to our viewers around the country. You were kind of there at the creation of the six-party talks, obviously know a lot about what's gone on in North Korea. Do you think we're making progress vis-a-vis North Korea today?
I do think that we're making some progress. Secretary Pompeo was just in Pyongyang again. And I think that the President and Kim Jong-un met and they sort of set in motion the possibility of getting some good things done to start to deal with the North Korean danger. I, for instance, will hope that you'll get inspectors in relatively quickly so that you can begin to verify any declarations about what weapons have been created. I would hope that we would very soon from the North Koreans begin to see that they are not going to move again toward testing of the like. That would make everyone safer. I think that's something that China favors. The advantage of the six-party talks was we had everybody at the table at the same time. We had Japan and Russia and China, South Korea, North Korea, the United States. But we're doing this more bilaterally now. South Korea is taking a bigger role. And yes, I think they have a chance to get some things done, but you're going to have to be patient because this isn't going to be done overnight.
Start with audience questions. Emily from Worcester, Mass. asks, if the trade war continues to escalate, What will happen to the 2.6 million jobs in the United States that are supported by U.S.-China trade?
Well, let's first talk about the term trade war. What we have so far is that we've had the administration impose some tariffs. We've had China do counter tariffs, and there have been tariffs and increased threats of greater tariffs. I'm a free trader, right? So I don't like tariff back and forth very much. I think that it doesn't serve anybody. I believe that the international economy is better when it's trading freely and more openly. But let's ask, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and see if we and China together can get to that without continuing this imposition of tariffs. And I think on the American side, there is a sense that after being admitted to the WTO, probably ahead of schedule, because everybody believed that the Chinese economy would be better inside the tent, so to speak, as outside of it, that there has been some disappointment in China's response and China's behavior in the international system. I mentioned intellectual property rights. There are whole segments of the Chinese economy that are closed to foreign investment. If you talk to American CEOs, they will tell you about the joint ventures that they were forced into only to lose their intellectual property to the joint venture. And so there is work that could be done to change some of the structural issues that are leading to some of these trade imbalances.
But as we do that, what do we do about the U.S. companies that are making tens of billions of dollars of profit in China?
Well,
and don't we have to, doesn't Vice President's speech not focus at all on that and the exports that are generated from the United States to China as a result of those businesses
There is
being
no
in China?
doubt. There is no doubt that the access of American companies, particularly for manufacturing and the ability to manufacture in China, although China is no longer the low-cost provider of labor, so some of this is shifting to other places. There's no doubt that there's been some benefit to the U.S. economy. As I said, the international economy needs Chinese economic growth. So let's be very clear about that. But there's increasing frustration that despite those numbers, there are trade practices that have to be addressed. And I actually think that I hear from my Chinese friends, and I do consider myself a friend of China. I hear from my Chinese friends, well, we don't know what it is we're being asked to do. Well, think about ways to protect intellectual property more effectively. Think about ways to open segments of the economy to, for instance, financial services. Don't hide behind the fact that these are state-owned enterprises. Why can't you have U.S. investment in some of these? And then I think you'll see a different atmosphere in the United States.
As a free trader, you can't like tariffs. So what tools does the Trump administration have to achieve these goals? And this is, by the way, not my question. This is Jack from Santa Barbara who asked this.
Yes, and it's a good question because what the administration has said is our only tool is tariffs. And so we're going to use tariffs until we get a response. I think we have many other tools at our disposal. One is that we do have the ability to look more closely at investment here, if Chinese investment here, if American investment cannot be done there. I don't want to get into a tit for tat, but China is very interested in investing internationally. Well, in order to do that, you're going to have to open up some of the investment rules and just ask for reciprocity. You don't have to have tariffs, just ask for reciprocity. And if you don't get reciprocity, now you know that you're in a different kind of economic relationship.
So you think the principle should be reciprocity, and if there is no reciprocity, then the United States takes an action
I believe we're going to have to press for reciprocity now. But China is now, I know that there's the language of still being a developing economy, but China is a mature economy at this point. It's an important economy. We need it to succeed. It will succeed better if it is more open. And so I would argue to my Chinese friends that doing away with some of these barriers will actually improve the prospects for the Chinese economy. Look at how well the Chinese large companies are doing, the Alibabas, the Tencents. Look at how well they're doing. they could be doing very well internationally as well, not just in the Chinese market, under different circumstances. So I think there's a win-win here, but it's going to require reciprocity.
Emily from Miami, Florida asks, how should the United States convince China and the Chinese people that it is not inhibiting China's development? And I think what she's getting at here is a view in China today that with the national strategic strategy, the defense strategy, and now Vice President Pence's speech, there's a view that we're seeking to contain and inhibit China's development. How do we persuade them otherwise?
I would say to China, in part, your development has been because the United States created an open international economy after World War II, and you, after Deng Xiaoping, took tremendous advantage of it. If the United States had wanted to protect and to stop China's economic growth, we would not have advocated for China to be in the WTO. If we had wanted to stop China's economic growth, we would not train Chinese students and see them go back to China. It's not the American way to try to inhibit somebody else's development. When we see China in the China 2025 say, however, we're going to do whatever it takes to surpass the United States in quantum computing and AI, you're going to get a response from the United States. My response from the United States would be, just you try. Because we've always been better at innovation than anybody else in the world, and so we're going to leapfrog you, and we're going to do it by keeping our universities open and bring your students over here and let them learn. We're still going to win that race.
Well, which was one of my questions was, do you think there's any chance? The Financial Times reported that the Trump administration debated ending Chinese student visas to the United States.
I would
do you think there's any chance?
Completely opposed to doing so. I'm a university professor. I want to train the best and brightest from all over the world. And I believe that everybody benefits if they're well trained and they go back to improve economic life for their countries and for their people. So I would be fundamentally opposed to that, and even to restrictions on what Chinese students can study. But the United States has to show a certain confidence in our system. And our system is one that believes in openness and innovation. If I could get the U.S. government to do one thing, I would increase the budget of the National Science Foundation so that we can do more in fundamental research. And I like our odds in the race for frontier technologies.
Which Tom from Tampa asks, right on this, Tampa, Florida asks, is Chinese innovation a threat to the United States?
Well, Chinese innovation to the United States is certainly, Chinese innovation is certainly a challenge, because some of the technologies in which China is innovating, if put to military use, could begin to erode American military power and advantages, and that's what people worry about. That's why you see the Defense Department taking such a hard line on certain kinds of investments, on certain kinds of technologies. But I think that, again, our best response has to be to continue to innovate and to continue to leapfrog. The United States has been through a few of these episodes. We went through the episode where the Soviet Union actually did beat us into space, but ultimately not to the moon. We went through it with Japan, where MITI, the Ministry for Trade, for Investment and Trade, was going to outdo us, and they were buying everything from Pebble Beach to Rockefeller Center, and they were going to, and we did just fine. I think that China would be well served to think about how this language around what they're doing in terms of frontier technologies is affecting the environment in the United States. I don't have a problem for China racing as hard and fast as it can toward innovation in frontier technologies. Every country should have that right, and I hope Germany races, and I hope Japan races, and that they all do. But don't do it in a way that sounds as if you're doing it to supplant the United States and to use it in confrontation.
Yeah. Well, Paul from Colorado Springs asks, do you believe the policy of preventing China's rise in AI is the right one, Presently, all U.S. efforts in the private sector are rife with duplication and lack coordination at the national level. Should the U.S. government be concentrating on developing and supporting a more comprehensive national AI policy?
Well, I don't mind having a comprehensive national AI policy, but then I hope that once it's issued, we leave it to the private sector to actually do what it wants to do. The idea that you drive innovation from the top, in some sense, is so contrary to the experiences that we've had. Where have the greatest breakthroughs come in the last 50 years? They've come out of garages in Palo Alto, right? They've come out of buildings in New York. They've come out of university labs in Austin, Texas. It is exactly the decentralization of the American innovation approach that has led, to borrow a Chinese phrase, many flowers bloom, and then we get to pick the best of them. I would actually warn that anybody who tries to do this as a single point of failure, we in the government know what is going to work, and so we're going to direct investment to that, is playing a very faulty game. I'll tell you a little funny story about this. So Bill Perry, who was Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering in the early 80s and later on Secretary of Defense, was asked, he tells this story, was asked on a Senate, in Senate hearings, very early, sort of 1981 or so, 1979 or so, did he think there was a future for personal computing? And he said, I don't have any idea why anybody would ever want a personal computer, right? So if the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, who's one of the smartest people I know, didn't see it coming, that's how innovation happens. You can't see it coming from the top. And so with all due respect to the Chinese, I'll keep our rather decentralized system.
Let's talk a little more about Vice President Pence's speech. Quoting from it, he said, previous administrations all but ignored China's actions, and in many cases they abetted them. I assume he wasn't applying.
I don't think he was talking about us. Clearly, he didn't mean Secretary Rice in that line.
But did previous administrations ignore Chinese actions? I mean, the Obama administration and its discussions on cyber, the representations.
There is always a tendency when you are in the White House to think that everything that you're doing is new. It's not. And I think that if you look back, there has been now a long history of trying to get China to deal with intellectual property rights, trying to get China to open its markets. The problem is that we are now at a place where these frustrations have accumulated over time. And so when you have the Vice President say that, perhaps what he is focusing on is the fact that these frustrations have been accumulating over time, and we've not been able to get a positive Chinese response on them. And in that sense, the ball has been in China's court.
Let's go to something you mentioned early in your introduction, your answer to the first question, which is human rights. And we've had press reports, and Robert from New York asks, what can the U.S. do to protect the Uyghur Muslims whom are being placed, by news reports at least, in re-education camps?
Yes, this is really an awful development. The Uyghurs, relatively small Muslim minority within China, have largely been mistreated for a very, very long time. And now, according to reports, that mistreatment is reaching kind of epic proportions. I would hope that the Chinese government, respecting the fact that this is Chinese territory, but that they would want to be more transparent about what's actually going on there. Why not have the International Red Cross come and see what is going on with the Uyghurs so that people can advocate for these people who are basically very helpless? Whenever I went to China, I raised human rights. I raised religious freedom with the Chinese. And I did it in a respectful way. But the U.S. has certain values about the treatment of human beings. And we're not going to step back from our values. We're not going to step back from advocating for and for being a voice of the voiceless. And in a case like this, I think that China is really sullying its international reputation by having this sort of thing happen. You know, and if China's going to play a bigger role in the international system, you have to recognize, too, that what happened with the head of Interpol recently,
Right.
where he just sort of suddenly disappeared, and then we find he's back at home in charges after being promoted to an international position of high authority. So as a country that is emerging as a great power and that wants to play a bigger role, some of this has to have more daylight, more light of day, more transparency, or that role's never going to materialize.
Lily from Oxford, since we don't have a venue in Oxford,
Yes.
England, I assume she's on watching this on the internet. Trump recently signed FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which expands national security screening of foreign investment. How has the balance between openness to foreign investment and protection of national security changed since you served in government?
Yes, I think it has been changing pretty rapidly because the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, when it was set up, was initially just to look at mergers and acquisitions, and it was really supposed to be from the perspective of, does this have an impact on national security? And because the Treasury Secretary heads it, the idea was to make very clear to people that this was not protectionism. It wasn't an effort to stop mergers and acquisition. We just wanted to be sure that the mergers and acquisitions didn't undermine American national security. The number of mergers and acquisitions that have been rejected has gone up pretty dramatically, and those related to China especially. And now with FIRMA, we are looking not just at mergers and acquisitions, but potentially investment into certain companies and certain technologies. Now, given that there's a kind of worldwide investment community, particularly in the venture world, I think this is actually going to be pretty hard to implement. We'll see how it's implemented. CFIUS is not really a body that's set up to do this very well, and so we will see. But I think that the idea that you are going to look at every investment that might have a national security impact, it seems to me a bit overwhelming for the government to do that.
Do you think there's a risk that we're tilting too far to the security, and that will devalue assets of all American companies
well, I think
and divert investment?
I think there's a risk. I don't think we're there yet, and we have to see how this plays out. If it really is only about investment in cases that are pretty clear, then maybe we'll be okay. But I am concerned that this is a place that we could be moving into an area with unintended consequences.
Matthias from Middletown, Connecticut. In what ways can liberal nations, such as the U.S., encourage an increasingly powerful China to abandon the use of force and integrate into the system of international law?
Well, the questioner asks a very important question because he speaks of liberal nations, and let me change that to liberal order. After World War II, a sense that we would have an international economy that was not zero-sum game, a sense that we would advocate for free trade, a sense that we would integrate more closely, and from that would come liberalization of countries, and a sense that there were international laws and there was an international order that we would all respect. And China decided to take a place in that international order with Deng Xiaoping's decision to open up and then accession to the WTO and so on and so on. And as I've said a couple of times, there's great disappointment that it hasn't really completely played out in the way that it should. And for instance, when you get a ruling, ICJ ruling on the South China Sea, and China says we simply don't acknowledge that, or they don't even bother to say they don't acknowledge it, really, right. You wonder about the dedication to rules-based. So I think the thing to say to China is that there are kind of two ways that great powers act in the international system. One is that they act only on their own interest in the narrowest sense of their own interest. And everybody else, you'll just have to get out of our way. The other is a sense that you have a broader definition of national interest, which includes the idea that if others are prosperous, if others enjoy peace, you're better off too. And the United States hasn't always been perfect in that regard, but I think for the most part, when you look at the international trading system that we set up, the United States probably had 60% of the world's GDP after World War II. Most of the world was flattened. Did we try to protect it? No. We opened up an international free trading system. We've tried to advocate for people who are struggling for democracy or freedoms or human rights, even when it hasn't been so clearly in our national interest. And so I would say to China, if you're going to play on the big stage, try to do it in a way that makes the world more prosperous and peaceful for everybody, not just for China.
I mean, that raises, of course, the question of use of force and abiding by international law raises the question of kind of the balance and perspective. As you said, the United States is not perfect. And China's use of force has, since '79, been pretty minimal. In fact, they don't use force. They may act in violation of international law, but they don't take over islands where they're people and kill them and stuff. And the United States, you know, the UN has certainly felt we have acted in violation of international law.
Well,
yes.
yes.
When you were in government,
well,
in fact,
yes,
I think.
Exactly. But I guess then if it's in violation of international law to overthrow a brutal dictator who we thought was getting weapons of mass destruction and has been a cancer in the Middle East and had been sanctioned before and was under 17 different Security Council resolutions for the kinds of act, if it was against international law to overthrow the Taliban, which was executing women in stadiums that were built for it by the United Nations so that we could clear that terrorist safe haven that attacked us in 9/11, well, you know, then maybe international law wasn't in the right place.
Well, that's what the Chinese would say about the South China Sea ruling,
it's
a sovereign, you know, their argument. I don't agree with it. I'm on record.
But let me just say,
Yeah.
this wasn't a ruling that the United States could not act in anticipatory self-defense in Afghanistan. International law allows...
the Secretary General said it was...
In Afghanistan, international law is and recognizes anticipatory self-defense. We can have an argument about whether Resolution 1441, passed by the UN Security Council, and saying that Iraq would suffer serious consequences because it was a threat to international peace and security, what that actually meant. But the United States actually did go to the UN, and the United States actually did debate it in the UN. What I would say about the South China Sea is, okay, let's debate it in the UN. If China would like to do that, I think we'd be all for it.
Madeline from Minnesota asks, how should the U.S. and China cooperate to combat the global threat of climate change?
Yeah. Well, first of all, China has a lot of reasons to deal with pollution in China. You can't breathe in Beijing, and it has become a social issue in China. It's become a political issue in China because there was the Chinese government was not actually accurately reflecting what the particulates were in the atmosphere. They were not accurately reflecting what the air quality was, and people started using their own little app to find out what the air quality actually was. And by the way, it wasn't very good. And so China has reason to shut down coal-fired plants, although it's still building them. It has reason to be concerned about what's happening to the environment. So does the United States. But the United States, international treaties or no, has been a leader in cleaning up its environment. Just ask people who lived in Los Angeles in the 1960s what the air quality was like then. We're going to get to dealing with climate change by the three E's. We have to have economic growth. No one is going to sacrifice economic growth. But we have to do it in an environmentally sustainable way. And we're going to have to do it in a way that gives us a different energy mix than we have now. And some of the getting to the different energy mix is in technology and innovation again. And I've been a fan of certain proposals out there that, for instance, if you want to trade in innovative technologies that would help climate change, they ought to be tariff-free. So I think there are a lot of ways that we could cooperate on the technological side, on the innovation side, because that's ultimately how we're going to get an energy mix that helps us to do both economic growth and environmental sustainability.
Ming from Nashville, Tennessee. Americans are not nearly as interested in learning about China as the Chinese are interested in learning about the United States. How can we encourage Americans to learn more about China, its culture, history, and people?
Well, I have an awful lot of students who are fascinated with China and trying to learn that incredibly difficult language and the like. I think we have to have more opportunities for our people to see each other. It's one thing to read about a country in a book. It's quite another to study there or visit there. Chinese students come here. We need American students to go there. We need to go back to the old high school exchanges. I know a lot of students who lived in Iowa for the first time from places because they were on high school exchanges. So I think we're going to do best in that regard. Our athletes already are admired. Our athletes there, their athletes here. Any way that we can find to get away from governments trying to get to know each other and getting our people to know each other, it's going to benefit us in the long run.
Let's see. Katie from Twitter asks, what do you believe is the future of educational visas for students coming from the U.S.?
Well, I hope that educational visas from the U.S. to China and China to the U.S. Will multiply. I am a very big believer in student exchange. I think we learn about countries not from books but by being there. And so, I know that right now there's a lot of talk about whether we should be limiting Chinese students coming to the United States. I just don't believe it. I think that's not who we are. And I hope more of our students will take Chinese language and go and visit. I've been at the great Chinese universities. There are an awful lot of very good English speakers there. I hope one day we'll have as many good Chinese speakers here.
Last question is somewhat of a commercial for the National Committee, because we spend a lot of time trying to find outstanding young Americans to go to China so we can educate them. And obviously in 1988, we made quite a selection in selecting you. So the last question is, what impact did your participation in the National Committee's Sino-Soviet American Study Group have on your thinking about China, about its relations with the Soviet Union and the United States at the time? And was it helpful in preparing you for your interactions with China as a government official?
This trip was life-changing for me. I'd been a Soviet specialist. I'd spent time in the Soviet Union. I'd never been to China. I don't know what I expected, but I saw a China that was already emerging as an entrepreneurial China. I remember the little stands with people selling things and thinking this place is changing. People were starting to wear colorful clothing, and I thought this is not the Mao jacket in gray and blue that I learned of when I was studying comparative communism as a student. I also got to see parts of China that most Americans don't see. We went up to the Sino-Soviet border, and we were in two little border towns, Suifenhe and Mudanjiang were the names of them. And very funny story. So my Chinese counterpart, foreign minister, Yang Shishi, said to me, "Do you know that your picture is in a restaurant in Mudanjiang?" And sure enough, from that trip in 1988, there was young Condoleezza Rice on a picture. So it was an enormously wonderful time and life-changing, and keep doing it, because we need to get young Americans to China. We need to get them there because, you invest in people. And I went on to become Secretary of State. Other people that you send there will go on to become titans of industry, CEOs and the like. Some will become great professors and bring on the next generation. Some will become elected politicians. It's really important at this time. There's a lot for us to do together. It's a hard time. We have a lot of differences. But I think that we can work through them, but not if we don't know each other. And that's what the National Committee does.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your incredible service to this country. It's really been an extraordinary, and is still an extraordinary career. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you.
It's deeply appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.